Good evening, dear guest. You've finally arrived in this place of mystery and thrills. I am the guardian of these ancient walls, the silent witness to secrets no one would dare whisper in the light of day. Tonight, I invite you to sit back, leave the outside world behind, and surrender to the shadows dancing on the walls. Hear that crackling sound? That's the fire that's been burning for centuries, the mute witness to tales so terrifying that even the bravest lose their sleep. Do you not fear the whispering of the wind, the sighs of those wandering souls who have lost their way here in the eternity of their despair? Tonight, I entrust you with these stories, tales that will freeze your blood, awaken your worst nightmares, and make you doubt reality itself. Are you ready to cross that threshold, to explore the abyss of horror and mystery? Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let my voice guide you through the darkness. After all, who knows what you might discover about yourself when confronted with the unspeakable? Welcome to my lair. Let the show begin. In the small town of Wexford, autumn was slowly setting in, draping the alleyways in orange and reddish hues. Ethan, a 17-year-old high school student, was known for his insatiable curiosity and penchant for technology. During a visit to the local antique shop, cluttered with odds and ends, his gaze was caught by a vintage smartphone he'd never seen before. Intrigued by its unusual design and facade, adorned with strange symbols, he decided to buy it, spurred on by an inexplicable impulse. That evening, Ethan turned on the phone. The screen flickered faintly before lighting up, revealing an unfamiliar interface dotted with archaic-looking icons. One of them, an application called Whisperer, particularly caught his eye. When he launched it, the screen displayed a series of geographical coordinates, followed by short, enigmatic and disturbing messages. Thinking of a game or an alternative geocaching application, Ethan decided to follow the mysterious instructions. His first destination was an old cemetery on the outskirts of town. The coordinates brought him to a recent grave, that of a teenager the same age as Ethan, who had died in tragic circumstances, according to rumour. The message on the phone screen was a quote from Dante Alighieri. "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." A shiver ran down Ethan's spine, but driven by morbid curiosity, he continued to explore the other coordinates. Each place he visited corresponded to a site of local tragedy, a burnt-out house, a bridge where several suicides had been reported, an abandoned hospital. Each time, the phone provided a message, a fragment of a poem or a riddle, each more macabre than the last. Reality blurred for Ethan. The town he thought he knew revealed a sinister face, a past haunted by dark events. Ethan's nights were soon filled with nightmares, visions of shadows and spectral figures whispering indistinct words. The smartphone seemed to act of its own volition, lighting up at night, broadcasting sounds, cries, whispers, muffled cries for help. Despite his growing fear, Ethan was irresistibly drawn to the device, as if some unknown force bound him to the phone. Ethan's friends began to worry about his increasingly erratic behaviour. He was distant, preoccupied, and his eyes betrayed a chronic lack of sleep. When they tried to talk to him, he was evasive, obsessed with solving the riddles the phone presented. The situation came to a head one stormy night, when the phone led him to a ruined old church outside town. At midnight, under the glare of lightning, Ethan stood in front of the dilapidated altar, smartphone vibrating and flickering with a dim light. The last message appeared: "Set them free." Suddenly, the walls began to vibrate. An icy wind blew through the cracks in the stones, and the cries of tormented souls filled the air. Ethan realized the horror of his situation. The device was a conduit, a link between the world of the living and that of spirits in pain. He had been chosen, or rather trapped, to carry out a macabre task of which he knew nothing. In a fit of desperation, he smashed the telephone against the stone floor, interrupting the ritual. Silence fell over the church, heavy and oppressive. Ethan collapsed, exhausted, realizing that his curiosity had led him to the gates of a world he wasn't meant to explore. He now knew that certain secrets had to remain buried, and certain doors closed forever. However, in the rubble of the smartphone, a faint glow persisted, as if, despite the destruction, the essence of the device refused to be extinguished, patiently awaiting its next user to resume its sinister cycle. In the ceaseless hustle and bustle of London, the Bakerloo subway line offered Clara a precarious refuge from her hectic daily routine. As a young lawyer in a major London law firm, she had become accustomed to coming home late, finding in the relative calm of the carriages a moment to decompress. One night, when the city streets were shrouded in dense fog, Clara boarded an almost deserted train, sitting by the window, her gaze lost in the fast-moving dark tunnel. The train stopped abruptly, the lights flickered on and off, and an oppressive silence fell over the carriage. The usual announcement failed to sound. Intrigued, Clara looked up at the subway map, realizing with a touch of anxiety that they had stopped at an unknown station on the line, Thornfield Station. She'd never heard of it or seen it on any map. The doors opened with a metallic creak. Driven by curiosity mixed with fear, Clara stepped off the train, her footsteps echoing strangely on the deserted platform. The station, bathed in an eerie gloom, looked as if it had been abandoned for years, the peeling walls telling the story of a forgotten place. Trying to find her way back, she entered a narrow corridor lit by flickering neon lights. Murmurs could be heard, like distant conversations, echoes of a past the station refused to forget. Clara quickened her pace, a dull fear rising within her. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the corridor, a woman dressed in a dress from another era, her eyes fixed, an expression of eternal distress on her face. Clara stopped dead in her tracks, breathless. The woman pointed to a torn poster on the wall, an advertisement for a decades-old exhibition, then disappeared in a whisper. Clara, her heart pounding, rushed towards the exit, but every corridor seemed to be the same. Every staircase took her back to the same desolate platform. The station was a labyrinth, a temporal trap where the living were not welcome. Exhausted, she finally found her way back to the platform where the train was still waiting, its doors wide open, inviting an uncertain departure. Clara rushed inside, collapsing on a seat, staring blankly, trying to catch her breath. The train set off again, gliding silently through the tunnels until it reached the familiar line, the familiar stations passing one by one. Clara got off at her usual station, the city lights welcoming her back to a reassuring reality. But the tranquility was short-lived. The next day, while rummaging through her bag, Clara found an old subway ticket, yellowed with age, bearing the letterhead Thornfield Station. Her blood ran cold. The cursed station had left its mark, an indelible memory of a night when the boundaries between worlds had blurred. The following days were marked by a series of unexplained events, fleeting shadows in her apartment, nocturnal murmurs, objects moving autonomously. Clara realized that something had followed her from Thornfield, an elusive, malevolent presence intent on weaving its web through the fabric of her reality. One night, Insomnia enveloped Clara in a suffocating veil, her thoughts swirling in a maelstrom of anguish and reminiscences of the station. In an almost hypnotic state, she rose to her feet, her bare feet brushing the cold floor, guiding her inexorably towards the window of her living room. There, under the spectral glow of a streetlight, the silhouette of the woman from the station silhouetted against the darkness, motionless, her pale face turned towards Clara, her hollow eyes piercing her with their abysmal emptiness. Her hand was raised, an accusing finger pointed directly at Clara, binding her to a forgotten promise, an unspoken pact that bound them together beyond human comprehension. Seized by visceral terror, Clara stepped back hastily, her heart racing, a muffled cry escaping her lips. Her foot became entangled in the carpet, throwing her off balance, and she fell heavily, her gaze averted from the window for a moment. When she dared to face the view outside again, the street was now empty, deserted by the ghostly presence, leaving only an oppressive silence and the rustling of leaves in the night wind. Yet the air was charged with an unspoken warning, a promise of doom woven into the very fabric of her existence. Clara understood with chilling clarity that Thornfield had set his sights on her, drawing her into a whirlwind of inexplicable events, marking her as one of his own. She was now a captive of an altered reality, a wanderer between dimensions, a link in a chain of lost souls who would never rest. Thornfield, this spectral station, this urban limbo, had chosen her, anchoring her to a destiny from which she could not escape, prisoner of a place that existed only for those whom the station, in its ethereal malevolence, decided to haunt. At the dawn of an era when the virtual cannibalizes the real, a group of friends, eager for adventure and thrills, decided to explore a ruined Scottish abbey, renowned for its dark past and the macabre legends that surrounded it. Lydia, the boldest of the bunch, was an influencer in search of captivating content for her followers. Armed with her state-of-the-art smartphone, she was ready to immortalize their journey through this place steeped in history and mystery. The abbey stood solitary on windswept moorland, its centuries-old stones bearing witness to the centuries that had passed. When they arrived, the atmosphere was saturated with a strange, almost palpable mist which seemed to shroud the ruins in a veil of unreality. Ignoring local warnings, the youngsters ventured inside, their laughter and footsteps echoing against the decrepit walls. Lydia, always in search of the perfect shot, proposed a group selfie in front of an ancient altar, adorned with symbols whose meaning had been lost in the meanders of time. As they posed, a chill wind blew through the broken arches, and the air became charged with an inexplicable electricity. The camera flash crackled, and the moment was captured. What they saw on the cold, bright screen of Lydia's smartphone sent an icy shiver down their spines. Behind the group, smiling and unconcerned, stood a veiled figure, spectrally white, with contours so blurred they seemed to dissolve in the surrounding air like a mist made flesh. His aura was palpable, a wave of pure terror that seemed to emanate from every pixel, enveloping friends in a sensation of oppression and profound unease. But it wasn't simply the indistinct appearance of the figure that chilled their blood, it was its expression, or rather the lack of it. Where there should have been a face, there was only a dark void, an abyss that sucked in light and gaze, as if this entity were an open door to a world of darkness. Laughter and conversation died instantly on their lips, replaced by a heavy silence, while the atmosphere around them seemed to condense, almost tangible in its sudden hostility. A feeling of invasion, of intrusion, crept into their minds, as if the presence in the photo was crossing the boundaries between its domain and theirs, blurring the line between image and reality. Without a word, as if driven by a primal survival instinct, the group rose to their feet, the urgency of fleeing this cursed place echoing in every beat of their hearts. They left the ruins in a hurry, but the image remained embedded in their memories, an indelible imprint of terror that would accompany them far beyond that accursed abbey, a shadow that would stretch across their lives, threatening to distort their very reality. Back in town, the day's events took a nightmarish turn. Lydia posted the photo on her networks, ignoring the shadow that had crept into their shot. Almost immediately, disturbing comments poured in, her followers pointing at the spectral figure, some terrified, others fascinated. As night fell, Lydia was plagued by visions, dreams in which the ruined abbey was rebuilt before her eyes, revealing scenes from a distant past, marked by dark rituals and inhuman sacrifices. The veiled figure played a central role, a priestess or witch whose soul was condemned to wander in limbo, seeking liberation or vengeance. In the days that followed, the influencer and her friends experienced strange phenomena, objects moved, unintelligible whispers in the dead of night, fleeting shadows caught in the corner of the eye. The photo seemed to have acted as a portal, a link between the abbey's cursed past and the modern world, allowing the entity to infiltrate their reality. The tension reached its peak when Lydia, alone in her home, sensed an oppressive presence. The walls of her apartment seemed to close in around her, and in the mirror, the image of the veiled figure superimposed itself on hers, its empty eyes staring at Lydia with burning intensity. A barely audible murmur arose, articulating words in a forgotten language, demanding something indecipherable but deeply threatening. Panicking, Lydia tried to destroy the photo, but her phone refused to respond. The image of the cursed abbey stubbornly displayed no matter what she did. As air pressure plummeted, plunging the apartment into an unearthly chill, the figure materialized before her, transcended from screen to reality, its hands outstretched towards Lydia, seeking to seize her essence, draining her of vitality to nourish its own ethereal existence. In a final effort of desperation, Lydia shattered the screen of her smartphone, the shards of glass flying around her, breaking the evil bond. The apparition dissipated with a howl of agony, leaving the influencer collapsed, surrounded by technological debris, silent witnesses to her confrontation with the inexplicable. The days that followed were filled with a heavy silence, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. Lydia, forever scarred by the experience, ended her career as an influencer, haunted by memories of that terrifying night when the barrier between worlds had been blurred. The abbey, meanwhile, remained unchanged, a sanctuary for lost souls, reminding those who dared approach it that certain doors once opened cannot be closed. In the heart of the wild Scottish moors, Blair Castle stood as an austere monument to the region's tormented history. Surrounded by lingering mists and legends of wandering spectres, the castle had acquired a sinister reputation, attracting the attention of paranormal researchers from around the world. A group of 4 paranormal investigators, equipped with their state-of-the-art equipment, decided to spend a night in the castle to try and capture evidence of the spirits that, according to legend, haunted these ancient walls. Their arrival at the castle coincided with dusk, when the shadows begin to lengthen and the veil between worlds becomes thinner. The first part of the night was strangely quiet. The Gothic corridors and deserted halls of the castle seemed almost peaceful, bathed in moonlight filtering through the broken windows. But as the night progressed, an oppressive atmosphere began to set in, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then the first whispers were heard. faint and indistinct at first, they gradually seemed to intensify, weaving themselves into the stagnant air like a fabric of worry. The investigators, intrigued and slightly anxious, began to follow these evanescent whispers, their recording devices in hand, hoping to capture every spectral syllable. The voices guided them through a labyrinth of corridors to a massive oak door, which creaked eerily on its hinges as they opened it. Inside, they discovered an ancient library, the shelves crumbling under the weight of dust-covered books, the air filled with the smell of musty, aged parchment. It was in this room that the whispering reached its peak. The words were now clear, imbued with age-old pain and rage. The voices seemed to be pleading for help while cursing those who had caused their suffering. The investigators, fascinated and terrified, recorded every sound, every syllable, aware that they were witnessing a paranormal manifestation of rare intensity. Suddenly, a chill wind swept through the room, and the candles they had lit suddenly went out, plunging the group into total darkness. Whispers turned to heart-rending screams, and indistinct shadows began to dance on the walls, as if the souls trapped in the castle were taking shape before their very eyes. In a panic, the investigators tried to flee the library, but the door had mysteriously locked. They were trapped, surrounded by the cries of angry spirits, their equipment going mad, picking up levels of paranormal activity beyond the norm. As one of them, hands trembling and forehead beaded with sweat, finally managed to break the recalcitrant door with a loud creak. An invisible, imperious force manifested itself with sudden violence. It struck them with the intensity of a raging storm, propelling them to the ground with a power beyond human comprehension. Their screams, imbued with visceral terror, mingled discordantly with the heart-rending pleas and vengeful curses of the spirits, creating a cacophony of horror that echoed through the charged air of the ancient library. In a chaos of desperate movements, the investigators struggled against the invisible adversary, their bodies dragged across the floor like rag dolls in the clutches of an angry child. They crawled, pushed, clawed at anything that might offer a semblance of support in their desperate flight. Their hands clung to dusty carpets and the legs of heavy wooden tables, seeking to wrest themselves from the grip of the furious entity assailing them. Finally, freed from the force holding them down, they straightened up and ran out of the cursed library, their footsteps echoing hurriedly on the stone floor, a symphony of survival in the enveloping darkness of the castle. The echo of their terror was lost and dissipated in the deserted corridors and abandoned halls, an oral testimony to human fear in the face of the inexplicable. As they moved away, the library door slammed with resounding force, as if the furious spirits were sealing behind them the chamber of tortured secrets and spectral memories. Once, safely outside the castle, they caught their breath, shaken by the intensity of their experience. The recordings they had made in the library were disturbing. Crystal-clear voices told tales of betrayal, torture, and death, souls eternally bound to the castle, demanding justice or seeking to share their suffering. The investigators left Blair Castle at sunrise, leaving behind shadows and whispers, but taking with them incontrovertible proof that some places hold within them the echoes of a tormented past, and that the dead sometimes refuse to remain silent. In the heart of the majestic Scottish countryside, near the mystical ruins of Cawdor Castle, lay an ancient wood renowned for its oppressive atmosphere and dark legends. Tales of lost travellers, lured by strange lights and never to return, circulated in neighbouring villages, fueling rumours of a curse hanging over the woods. A group of 4 friends, intrigued by these legends and eager for adventure, decided to camp in Cawdor Wood, armed with their curiosity and scepticism. Their names were Liam, Sophie, Ethan, and Mia. They were young, eager to discover, and totally unaware of the forces they were about to challenge. Their first day in the woods was peaceful, with birdsong and the whisper of wind in the leaves creating a reassuring melody. But as the sun declined over the horizon, an indefinable sensation began to creep over them. A growing unease, as if the trees themselves were watching them with a disquieting curiosity. As night fell, they lit a campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the gnarled trunks. It was then that the first strange phenomena appeared. Discreet footsteps echoed around them, as if something or someone were moving in the darkness just beyond the circle of light. Sophie, the first to express concern, suggested that they might not be alone. Her words fueled the group's anxiety, and they instinctively moved closer to the fire, scanning the darkness beyond the flames. As the flames of the campfire crackled and cast their flickering light on the friends' tense faces, the darkness around them came alive with an ominous presence. Suddenly, as if the night itself were coming to life, eyes emerged from the darkness, twinkling with an unearthly brilliance. At first, there were only a handful of them, hanging in the darkness like fallen stars, but soon they multiplied, forming a terrifying constellation that watched them with chilling intensity. Their phosphorescent green eyes pierced the darkness, staring at their friends with a curiosity that had the coldness of a scalpel. They were motionless, but alive, vibrating with an alien energy, each pair of pupils glowing with an out-of-this-world gleam. Some were tall and round, others narrow and elongated, but all shared the same malevolent gleam, the same fixed gaze that seemed to probe their souls. The friends, seized by visceral fear, stood up abruptly, their bodies stiff with horror. They stood there, hesitant, feeling the weight of thousands of eyes upon them, an invisible, spectral audience. The eyes followed them. No matter how they moved or turned their heads, every movement captured and tracked with inhuman precision. This silent yet oppressive presence enveloped them, making them feel exposed and vulnerable, as if every secret, every thought were laid bare under the merciless gaze of these nocturnal entities. The air became charged with palpable tension, their heartbeats echoing loudly in the suffocating silence, each breath an effort in the terror-laden atmosphere. In a panic, they decided to leave immediately, abandoning their camp and making their way through the wood. But the wood seemed alive, branches intertwining to block their path, roots rising to impede their footsteps. As they struggled to escape, eyes continued to watch them, gradually moving closer, revealing vaguely human shapes, ethereal silhouettes gliding between the trees. The wind's whispers became whispers, voices that seemed to speak an ancient language, forming words the mind couldn't grasp, but the heart recognized as threatening. Liam stumbled, his fall breaking the oppressive silence, and this was the signal for the entities to reveal themselves fully. Ghostly figures emerged from the shadows, their faces distorted by eternal torment, their hands outstretched towards the living. The friends ran, driven by a primal terror, but Cawdor's wood did not release its hold. They seemed to run in circles, each attempt to escape taking them deeper into the darkness. Finally, exhausted and desperate, they came to an ancient oak tree, its branches stretching out like the arms of a giant. Spectral figures surrounded them, murmuring words from another time, sealing their fate. The next morning, the authorities found the camp abandoned, but no trace of the four friends. The forest seemed peaceful, bathed in morning rays, indifferent to the fate of the intruders. The investigators scoured the woods, calling out the names of the missing men, but only the echo of their voices answered, reinforced by the murmuring of the leaves. Nature had reclaimed its rights, erasing all traces of the young men's passage, as if the earth itself had chosen to swallow up their existence. Days of intensive searching came to nothing. Their sleeping bags lay scattered around the extinguished fire, their cell phones abandoned on the ground, their screens reflecting a stubborn silence. It was as if the wood had absorbed the friends into its essence, turning them into another legend to be whispered on dark nights. Corder Wood remained a mystery, a place where the boundary between the real and the unreal thinned, where lost souls found refuge or a trap, depending on the ancient whims of the spirits that dwelt there. In time, the story of the four friends became a warning to locals and visitors alike. Some said that on moonless nights their shadows could still be seen among the trees, or their voices heard on the wind, an eternal reminder that some places are not meant to be trodden by the living. In the historic town of Warwick, the 1,000-year-old castle stood as a silent witness to centuries gone by. A new attraction had been added for visitors, a live surveillance camera allowing anyone on the internet to view the castle's corridors and halls at any time, day or night. The initiative was well received, attracting the curiosity of history and paranormal enthusiasts the world over. But this curiosity soon turned into a morbid obsession for some, as inexplicable phenomena began to appear on the screen, especially during the dark hours of the night. Among the regular observers were Alex and Jamie, two paranormal enthusiasts who had been following the live broadcast from the beginning. One night, as they scrutinized the screen intently, a hunched figure appeared in the great hall, moving in a way that defied all human logic. Its presence was ephemeral, disappearing as soon as they tried to capture it on video. Intrigued by the strange phenomena they had observed on the live broadcast and driven by a fascination mingled with terror, Alex and Jamie felt irresistibly drawn to Warwick Castle. Their curiosity driving them to overcome their fears, they decided to conduct their own investigation on site, hoping to unravel the mystery of the spectral figure and unexplained events that seemed to haunt the ancient walls of the fortress. Arriving on the scene, they were the embodiment of modern ghost hunters, armed not with traditional weapons, but with a technological arsenal designed to detect and record paranormal activity. Their cameras, ready to capture the slightest visual anomaly, were complemented by tape recorders designed to capture possible spectral communications or noises that the human ear could not perceive. EMF sensors, meanwhile, were used to detect fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, often interpreted as a sign of paranormal presence. With determination tinged with apprehension, they crossed the threshold of Warwick Castle, instruments in hand, ready to confront the shadows of the past. Their objective was clear: to uncover the truth behind the apparitions, stirring the collective imagination and disturbing the serenity of the historic castle. Their hearts beat in unison, torn between the excitement of the adventure and the fear of what they might discover in the heart of the night, in the depths of Warwick Castle. Their nocturnal investigation began under a sky obscured by clouds, the castle shrouded in an almost supernatural silence. The corridors and halls looked different from the surveillance camera, more menacing, as if charged with a disquieting energy. As they explored the west wing, where the figure had been seen most often, their equipment began to react strongly. Temperatures dropped sharply, and their EMF detectors crackled with activity. Then they saw it. The silhouette, more clearly this time a humanoid form, wrapped in what appeared to be shreds of ancient clothing. The figure seemed unaware of their presence, continuing its enigmatic wanderings. Alex and Jamie followed at a distance, filming every movement, every step. But suddenly, it stopped, turning towards them. Her eyes, empty and dark, stared back at the two friends, and an icy terror overwhelmed them. In the silent immensity of Warwick Castle, the scream that suddenly tore through the air was so high-pitched and charged with despair that it seemed to pierce the barrier of time, emanating from a bygone era when pain and suffering permeated the walls of this ancient fortress. That howl, echoing through the vaulted corridors and deserted halls, carried with it the agony and distress of 1,000 lost souls, a cry for help, or perhaps a curse cast across the centuries. As this supernatural cry grew louder, a series of strange phenomena were unleashed in the castle. The lights, which until then had dimly illuminated the dark corridors, began to flicker frantically, as if an invisible force were toying with them, trying to communicate or intimidate the daring living who dared disturb the repose of spirits. The bulbs crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced chaotically across the stone walls, creating an atmosphere of palpable anxiety. At the same time, the castle's massive doors, forged centuries ago, began to slam violently, as if unseen hands were furiously pushing them open. Each slam resounded like a thunderclap, shaking the very foundations of the castle, and seemed to be a sinister warning or a manifestation of anger against those who had disturbed the quietude of this accursed place. The walls themselves, mute witnesses to so many stories, began to vibrate slightly, an almost imperceptible shudder running through the cold stone, as if the very soul of the castle were awakening. This subtle yet disquieting vibration gave the impression that the entire structure was animated by an ancient anger, a residual force stemming from tragic and violent events whose echoes still haunted this place. Alex and Jamie, frozen in horror and disbelief, felt the ground give way beneath their feet at the intensity of these paranormal manifestations. The screaming, lights, doors and vibrations composed a terrifying symphony, perhaps heralding the awakening of a forgotten entity, ready to claim justice or share its eternal pain with the living. Alex and Jamie, realizing that the situation was getting out of hand, decided to flee, running through the labyrinthine corridors, pursued by the figure and the incessant screams. Every turn led them in a circle. Every door brought them back inside, as if the castle itself refused to let them go. Exhausted, disoriented, they found themselves in the great hall where it had all begun. The figure stood before them, blocking their only way out. Around them, the shadows of the hall took shape, rising like spectres from another age, victims of the castle's tortured past. Alex and Jamie realized that they had become part of a centuries-old tragedy, pawns in a spectral game whose rules and outcome they knew neither. Their last thought was for the surveillance camera, which continued to broadcast live, capturing their horrific end for an invisible audience, a powerless witness to the eternal drama of Warwick Castle. Nestled in the heart of Scotland's verdant valleys, Glamis Castle, with its towering towers and ancient legends, had always captured the imagination of locals and visitors alike. Among its many mysteries, one portrait in particular had a reputation for being cursed, that of Lady Eleanor, a former resident of the castle whose eyes seemed to follow observers across the room. Eleanor was known for her tragic beauty and fateful fate, locked away in a castle tower until her mysterious death. Her portrait, dating from the 16th century, was a magnificent but disturbing work of art, arousing unease in those who contemplated it for too long. Olivia, a young art historian, was fascinated by the castle's history, and in particular by the legend surrounding Eleanor's portrait. She decided to spend a week at the castle to study the work closely and document the strange phenomena associated with it. As soon as Olivia stepped through the heavy gates of Glamis Castle, she was enveloped by the imposing aura of Gothic architecture, where every stone and stained glass window seemed to tell an ancient story, marked by drama and secrets. The slender towers reached for the sky like accusing fingers, and the time-worn gargoyles silently watched the newcomers, their grotesque expressions frozen for eternity. The castle staff, usually welcoming and proud to share in the history of this ancestral home, displayed an unusual reserve, their slightly forced smiles unable to mask an underlying tension. Their gazes often wandered to the room where Eleanor's portrait sat, as if they feared Olivia's study might disturb something better left alone. Olivia, armed with her advanced research equipment, headed for the room in question, an elegant space where the portrait was the centerpiece. The walls, draped in antique tapestries, framed the painting of Eleanor, whose eyes seemed to greet the researcher in eloquent silence. She carefully unpacked her cameras, tape recorders and EMF sensors, strategically positioning them to capture any unusual manifestations, her heart pounding at the thought of the secrets these instruments might reveal. Despite her scientific enthusiasm, Olivia couldn't help but feel a touch of apprehension as she prepared her equipment, the portrait's eyes following her every move. The air in the room seemed charged with silent anticipation, and the ambience of the castle, with its shifting shadows and almost imperceptible whispers, was already beginning to imbue Olivia's mind with a mixture of awe and unease. The first few days were calm, although Olivia felt a strange sensation, as if Eleanor's painted eyes were staring at her constantly. She put this down to fatigue and her imagination, overly influenced by local legends. The following night, wrapped in the heavy silence of the castle, Olivia devoted herself to the meticulous examination of the shots she had taken of the portrait during the day. In the subdued light of her lamp, she scrutinized every detail, every nuance of the work, when her gaze was caught by a disturbing detail. Eleanor's features, once imbued with a noble sadness, seemed to have changed almost imperceptibly, as if the emotions captured by the artist centuries before were in the throes of mutation. Her hands trembling slightly, Olivia grabbed another photo, taken a few hours earlier, for immediate comparison. There, before her incredulous eyes, was a subtle but undeniable transformation. The corners of Eleanor's mouth were now twisted in an expression of bitterness, and her once melancholy eyes now shone with an intense gleam, as if a long-suppressed anger was beginning to express itself through paint. Intrigued and deeply disturbed, Olivia lined up the snapshots on her improvised desk, tracing the evolution of Eleanor's face through time. Each new image revealed a progression in the lady's expression, from melancholy sadness to tormented despair, each wrinkle, each curve of the face seeming to move slowly towards a new emotional configuration. This discovery defied all logic. How could a portrait, a simple capture of an eternal moment, change like this? Olivia felt a chill run down her spine, aware that she might be witnessing a supernatural phenomenon, a message or manifestation from the beyond through art. Eleanor's face, imprisoned within the canvas, now seemed to implore, or perhaps warn, the researcher of the hidden history and pain buried within the walls of this ancestral castle. This shocking discovery spurred Olivia to pursue her nocturnal research, despite the growing feeling that she was not alone. Nights at Glamis Castle became a mixture of fascination and horror as she watched the portrait come to life before her incredulous eyes. One night, as a thunderstorm erupted outside, the castle lights flickered on and off, plunging Olivia into darkness with only Eleanor's painting for company. By the light of her flashlight, she saw, horrified, that the portrait was now animated. Eleanor's face twisted into an expression of rage. The room suddenly filled with ghostly murmurs, and the temperature plummeted. Paralysed by fear, Olivia couldn't take her eyes off the painting, where Eleanor seemed to be struggling to extricate herself from her frame. As the murmurs turned to screams, a painted hand sprang from the painting, clawing the air in Olivia's direction. In a desperate gesture, she threw the flashlight at the painting, shattering the protective glass and extinguishing the light. A deafening silence filled the room. When the castle staff finally entered, alerted by the noise, they found Olivia unconscious on the floor, Eleanor's portrait intact, as if nothing had happened. Olivia left Glamis Castle the following day, the terrifying images etched forever in her memory. Eleanor's portrait continued to hang in the hall, its enigmatic eyes staring into space, waiting for the next soul brave enough or foolhardy enough to unravel the mysteries of her cursed existence. Nestled on a steep cliff, swept by sea winds and spray, stood the old Marwick Lighthouse, an isolated spot renowned for its tales of shipwrecks and heroic rescues. The lighthouse had been the silent witness to many events over the centuries. Recently assigned to the lighthouse, Thomas, a young keeper, was fascinated by its history and isolation, seeing it as an escape from tumultuous city life. Thomas's early days were marked by solitude and routine, punctuated by the steady rhythm of the lighthouse light piercing the night fog. However, his quiet existence was turned upside down when he discovered an old newspaper covered in dust and cobwebs hidden beneath the engine room floor. Intrigued, Thomas began to read the diary, which belonged to a former keeper named Jeremy, who had lived in the lighthouse over a century ago. The first few entries were mundane, detailing daily life at the lighthouse. But as Thomas's reading progressed, the stories became darker and more desperate. Jeremy wrote of bodiless voices whispering after dark, moving shadows dancing on the walls, and terrifying visions of drowned men knocking on the lighthouse door during storms. He spoke of a malevolent presence that seemed to emanate from the lighthouse itself, haunting him, slowly driving him to madness. As Thomas turned the pages of the newspaper, absorbed in these horrifying tales, he began to notice disturbing similarities with his own nocturnal experiences. Indistinct whispers woke him at night, and he perceived fleeting movements in the shadows. As the storm's howling winds battered the lighthouse, shaking its windows and vibrating its walls, Thomas felt a visceral fear creep over him. The pages of the diary, scattered around him, seemed almost to vibrate with a dark energy, as if the words of despair and madness they contained had been imbued with the suffering of their author. The knocks on the door became more insistent, echoing through the structure of the lighthouse like the heartbeat of a gigantic monster. Each knock seemed to echo directly into Thomas's soul, awakening ancestral fears. The voices, meanwhile, were no longer indistinct whispers, but clear, desperate calls, pronouncing his name with frightening intimacy, as if they knew him personally, as if they'd been waiting for him. Paralysed by horror, Thomas could barely breathe. The walls of the lighthouse, its protectors of stone and brick, seemed to be closing in, the air becoming more and more stifling. Footsteps echoed, heavy and inescapable, up the spiral staircase. Each resonance was a hammer blow to Thomas's will to remain rational, to believe that it was all a figment of his imagination. The staircase seemed to stretch on forever. Each step the invisible entity took, increasing the intensity of the terror that gripped Thomas's heart. He knew that confrontation was inevitable, that something inexplicable and terrifying was heading towards him with ruthless determination. In his room, the only barriers between him and the unknown were the wooden door and the dim light from his oil lamp, which flickered as if it too sensed the approaching darkness. Thomas, realizing that escape was not an option, braced himself for what the night had in store, the last pages of Jeremy's diary burning in his mind, an ominous warning of what might await him. In a fit of desperation, Thomas grabbed the diary, running to the lighthouse lantern, where he threw it into the furnace, hoping to end the curse that bound lost souls to the lighthouse. As the book burned away, a heart-rending cry was heard, as if some ancient force had been released or destroyed. The next day, the lighthouse was silent, bathed in a peaceful morning light. Thomas never knew whether what he had experienced was real or the product of his isolation and imagination. But one thing was certain: he would never again rest in the solitude of the lighthouse, haunted by memories of that night when the line between reality and horror had blurred. In a small town, bordered by a dense, ancient forest, a renowned botanist, Dr. Emily Harris, discovered an unknown species of plant on one of her expeditions. She was captivated by its strange beauty and deep black flowers that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Deciding to study this discovery in detail, she took a specimen to her laboratory on the outskirts of town. Emily began her research, fascinated by the plant's resilience and unique properties. She noticed that the plant reacted in an unusual way to its environment, adapting rapidly, almost with an intelligence of its own. As the days passed, her obsession with the plant grew to the point where she neglected her other responsibilities. One night, while Emily was working late, she began to hear almost imperceptible whispers. Thinking at first that it was fatigue or the wind, she paid no attention. However, the murmurs became clearer, more insistent, seeming to emanate from the plant itself. They spoke in a language Emily didn't understand, but the intonation was undeniably pleading, almost melancholy. Disturbed but intrigued, Emily intensified her research, discovering that the plant could influence its environment in far more sinister ways than she had imagined. She realized that the plant's roots extended far beyond its pot, seeping through the cracks of the laboratory, feeding on whatever they found. The following weeks were marked by a series of disturbing events in the city. Residents began to report disturbing nightmares, feelings of despair, and an increase in malevolence within the community. Some even spoke of visions of black roots creeping into their homes at night. Emily, realizing with horror that the plant was at the heart of these phenomena, decided it was time to destroy it. But the plant, as if understanding her intention, had other plans. The roots, now powerful and tentacular, had anchored themselves deep in the soil and in the foundations of the laboratory. In the suffocating darkness of the night, as Emily, overwhelmed by the weight of her discoveries and the consequences of her actions, stood in the heart of her laboratory, ready to end her life, nature itself took a sinister turn. The roots, which she had manipulated and altered in her quest for knowledge, seemed to awaken from a deep sleep, pulsing with new, terrifying life. As she poured the last drops of poison into her glass, the ground beneath her feet began to vibrate gently. Confused, Emily watched in horror as the roots, like creatures thirsting for vengeance, twisted and contorted, springing from the ground like tentacles in search of their prey. Their movement was not chaotic, but intentional, as if guided by an obscure will, seeking to punish the one who had betrayed them. Roots rose up, wrapping themselves around the shelves filled with vials and documents, ripping them from the walls with brutal force. The walls themselves began to crack and groan under the relentless pressure of the roots, which insinuated themselves into every interstice, every crack, tearing apart the very structure of the laboratory. The glass panes, unable to withstand the growing tension, shattered with a deafening crash, sending shards of glass raining down like deadly rain across the room. Emily, trapped in this chaos, realized with horror that her end would come not from her own hand, but from her own creations. Roots encircled her, drawing inexorably closer, their tapering tips sliding across the floor with a menacing hiss. She tried to flee, to evade their grasp, but every step was impeded by the vengeful tangle tightening around her. In a last gasp of desperation, she grabbed a scalpel, trying to cut her way through the living mass. But the roots, as if endowed with a consciousness of their own, dodged each blow, drawing ever closer until they surrounded her completely, encircling her body in a deadly embrace that left no hope of escape. Emily's last cries were lost in the din of destruction, muffled by the vengeful growl of the nature she had tried to dominate. As the roots tightened their grip, plunging their appendages into her flesh, she realized in a final moment of lucidity that her experiments had not only altered the plants, but had awakened in them an ancient and implacable force, determined to restore the balance she had broken. In a last-ditch effort to escape the plant's onslaught, Emily made her way through the chaos, the roots pursuing her, determined not to let their threat be eliminated. She managed to get out, but not before the roots grabbed her by the foot, dragging her towards them. Emily fought hard, finally managing to free herself, but the plant had already shown its true power. The laboratory collapsed behind her, a tomb for the creature she had unwittingly released into the world. The botanist escaped, forever scarred by events. The black plant remained in the ruins of the laboratory, waiting, its roots spreading slowly but surely, ready to spread their evil influence across the city and beyond. Emily knew that, even if she had survived, the fight against the roots of evil had only just begun. In the bustling city of Lyon, an annual carnival transformed the streets into a living theatre of colour, music and mystery. It was during this event that Leia, a young costume designer with a passion for legends and the supernatural, discovered a unique mask in a small antique store hidden away in a forgotten alleyway. The mask, with its delicate features and enigmatic expression, seemed to whisper stories from another world. When Leia first laid eyes on the mask in the antique store, a wave of fascination swept over her. Despite the warnings of the old antiquarian, whose face was marked with deep furrows of concern and warning, she was drawn to the object as if by a magnetic force. He spoke of a distant origin, shrouded in the fog of ages, and of dark legends that whispered tales of misfortune and altered destinies. But Leia, consumed by her curiosity and her attraction to the unexplained, chose to ignore these dark omens. That evening, with the carnival in full swing, she placed the mask over her face. The sensation was immediate and spellbinding. A wave of cold ran across her skin, followed by a shiver that seemed to awaken her senses to a new perception. The mask spoke to her, not in words, but in impressions and emotions, a whisper from another era that resonated through the centuries to connect with her, her spirit, her soul. As she mingled with the jubilant crowd, Leia felt detached, observing a world that was both familiar and strangely foreign. The mask opened the doors to a parallel reality where colours seemed more vivid, sounds more acute, and every face told her a story. But this mystical connection was accompanied by a growing sense of vertigo, as if the mask wasn't just a spectator, but was trying to draw her into something unknown and unexplored, a territory where beauty rubbed shoulders with terror and pleasure with pain. Leia was beginning to understand that the mask was not just an object, but a portal, a link to an essence that human reason was not meant to understand or endure. As she strolled through the busy streets, Leia's perceptions began to change. Joyous laughter turned into ominous whispers, bright lights into menacing shadows. The mask revealed a distorted version of reality, where nightmarish creatures mingled with the crowd, invisible to all but her own eyes. As the evening wore on, the power of the mask intensified, plunging Leia into a world where the boundaries between reality and fantasy became blurred. The familiar streets of Lyon became a labyrinth of terror, populated by entities that seemed to recognize and covet her. Terrified, Leia tried to remove the mask, discovering to her horror that it had fused with her skin, feeding on her fears and reveling in her despair. Each attempt to remove it only intensified his visions, dragging him deeper into the otherworldly abyss. In a last effort to escape the curse, Leia headed for the Saône, hoping that the sacred water might free her from the mask's grip. But as she approached the river, the shadowy creatures drew closer, their whispers turning into deafening screams. On the bridge, against the dancing reflection of the black water, Leia faced her reflection, distorted by the mask. The mask's eyes shone with a malevolent glint, and she knew that her will alone would not be enough to break the bond that bound her to this cursed artifact. In an act of absolute despair, Leia threw herself into the cold waters, hoping that drowning would offer her an escape from her prison. But as the waters engulfed her, the mask clenched even tighter, its oppressive presence accompanying Leia into the depths. The next day, the mask was found on the banks of the Saône, empty, awaiting its next wearer. Leia was now just another missing person, swept away by the river, or perhaps lost forever in the in-between world, revealed by the otherworldly mask. In the heart of the English countryside, Belfray Manor, with its once sumptuous gardens, had long been abandoned. When Sarah, a young landscape gardener, inherited the estate, she was immediately captivated by its wild, melancholy beauty. The gardens, in particular, seemed to harbour a mysterious aura, a silent call to reveal their forgotten secrets. As Sarah explored the overgrown paths and faded flower beds, she discovered strange clues, disfigured sculptures, old English inscriptions on weathered stones, and hidden underground passages. She learned that the Belfrays were a 17th century noble family who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The neighbouring village whispered tales of curses and dark practices, but Sarah had no idea of the true horror behind these rumours. Driven by a fervent desire to unravel the mysteries of the past, Sarah threw herself wholeheartedly into the project of restoring the gardens of Belfray Manor. Armed with her gardening tools, she pruned, dug and planted, hoping to breathe new life into a place steeped in a dark and tumultuous history. Each root dug up, each bush pruned, seemed to awaken the sleeping memories of the earth, as if the soil itself wished to tell its own macabre story. As she worked, horrifying visions came to her with increasing intensity. When she closed her eyes, even for a moment, she was transported back in time, witnessing a scene of horror that defied all humanity. The members of the Belfray family, dressed in their period garb, gathered around an opulent table, not for an ordinary banquet, but for an abominable ceremony where human flesh was the main course. Servants, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear, brought in trays laden with body parts, offering these macabre offerings to the masters of the house. Sarah could almost smell the scent of blood and death permeating the air, hear the sound of jaws closing on flesh, the mad laughter of the Belfrays as they revelled in their forbidden meal. The family's eyes, reddened by madness and cruelty, shone with a sinister glint, reflecting their depraved nature and perverse pleasure in transgressing the most basic laws of morality and humanity. These visions of decadence and violence haunted Sarah, leaving indelible traces of terror in her mind. Each new day spent restoring the gardens became an ordeal, a disturbing journey into the abyss of the human soul, where she was forced to rub shoulders with the shadows of the Belfray family, forever locked in their macabre dance with death. Each night the visions became clearer, more terrifying. Sarah could hear the screams of the victims, the demented laughter of the cannibals, and almost smell the scent of blood and death. The gardens seemed to come alive, showing her fragments of that bygone era, as if the earth itself were imbued with the cruelty of the Belfrays. One evening, as twilight enveloped the gardens, Sarah discovered a crypt hidden beneath an old fountain. Inside, the remains of dozens of bodies lay piled up, some barely recognizable, others marked by signs of cannibalism. Amidst the bones, a macabre altar still bore the traces of ancient rituals. By touching the altar, Sarah unwittingly triggered an ancient curse. The Belfray spirits, hungry and vengeful, were unleashed, seeking to relive their morbid banquets. That very night, the cannibalistic ghosts began to haunt the gardens, turning the estate into a hunting ground, with Sarah as their prey. She tried to flee, but the gardens, now alive and malevolent, trapped her, inevitably leading her to the crypt. The Belfray spectres surrounded her, whispering promises of pain and despair, eager to integrate a new member into their cursed family. In a final burst of despair, Sarah reached the crypt, hoping to find sanctuary. But the spirits were waiting for her, their faces distorted by hunger and madness. As the ghostly hands seized her, ready to drag her into eternal darkness, Sarah realized that Belfray's gardens would forever hold their horrific secret, feeding the curse with her own blood. The next day, the estate was found empty, shrouded in an oppressive silence. The gardens, lush and vibrant, seemed to wait patiently for their next victim, ready to reveal the horrors of the past to anyone who dared enter their cursed alleys. My dear listeners, as the shadows of night stretch out and the crackling of the fire begins to fade, it's time for me to close the grimoire of tales that have, I hope, awakened your imagination as much as your fears. I'd like to thank you sincerely for your captivated attention and your courage, for it takes courage, doesn't it, to listen to these stories which, who knows, may well have a basis of truth. Ah, yes, the truth. It's often stranger and more terrifying than fiction, isn't it? Perhaps, after all, some of tonight's tales aren't simply tales to lull or keep awake inquiring minds. Perhaps they hide, in the folds of darkness, truths that only the boldest or most reckless would wish to explore. As you retire to the relative comfort of your beds, I wish you a night filled with dreams, or should I say nightmares. Fear nothing, or perhaps everything, for it's in uncertainty that the real fright lurks. And who knows? Maybe our paths will cross again, in a night shrouded in mist, to share other stories whose echoes haunt the corridors of time and imagination. I bid you farewell, not adieu, but au revoir. May the shadows of the night gently envelop you, and remember, my dear listeners, that behind every shadow may lie a secret of our world, or another. Good night, sweet dreams, or the other way around. And now I shall retreat into the darkness that surrounds me, where whispers of the past and shudders of the unknown mingle in a macabre dance. Perhaps, in the darkness, you'll find the answers you seek, or questions you'd never dare ask. Sleep well, if you can.